Today's stuff we're going to learn is Moed Katan Daf Kafav. Today's stuff is sponsored by Erica Kolach in loving memory of her mother's 6th Yurtzeit, the Honorable Constance Glubi, Chaya Rachel Bat Shmuel Zichrona Lebracha. In later years, she downplayed her brilliant career, but always lived by Tzedek Tirdof. Today's stuff is also sponsored by Gita and David Neufeld for the Refuah Shlema of Rachel Bat Golda Mariam. Refuah Shlema. Okay, 2 announcements. First of all, thank you for all who joined the class last night. I was sorry there was one of the emails, the wrong Zoom link went out. My apologies to those who had issues with it. Anyway, pay attention. Next week, we will send the correct one. So don't use last week's email. And thank you for all who came. It was great. It was fun to learn together. If anyone missed it, everything will be up online today on the course website. You can find it from our homepage. It says courses. You can go on there. You can register. It's for free. And then you can see everything in the course. There's worksheets. There's for Chavruta. There will be videos up there. So everyone is welcome to use those materials. The second thing is our Siyum is on Thursday. So register 7 p.m. Israel time. So we have a great program and looking forward to seeing you there. Okay. With that, we'll get started. Tanu Rabbanan, at the bottom of Kaf He Amud Bet, the last word, okay, or the last words. It's an abbreviation. Tanu Rabbanan means we learn in a Braita. We're now going to have the first Amud. Today is the first section of today's daf. Is all a very, very easy structure. We're going to have a Braita with a list of people who tear Kriya for someone, something that happens, a whole list. All of these situations are situations like a father and mother that when you tear Kriya, you're never allowed to fix it. In the end, right, we learned before that you can fix them, right? You can either baste it or you can actually fix it all entirely, depending on, right, if it's after the shloshim, you can start basting it. If it's after the shiva. If it's after the shloshim, you can already fix it up perfectly, unless it's for your father and mother. Today, we're going to see there's a whole list of other cases where you also can't fix it properly. And then, so the Braita is going to just list them. And then the Gemara is going to go into, how do we know that you, number one, tear Kriya, and how do we know that you can never fix it in these situations? And that's going to be the entire first Amud is just going through one by one. There'll be some questions on each and things that the Gemara goes in depth about. And that's all what I did. It's all on the chart. Okay, there's a big, long chart on the sheet, and that's the whole first section of the daf. So the Braita starts out, Elu Kla'in she'en mitachim. These are ones that you can never fix. HaKorea alaviv alimo, tearing Kriya for your parent. Al Rabo, by the way, Daf Michelle Farber this week that went up last night is all about Kriya and relevant, all sorts of situations, etc., going more in depth into the halachot of tearing, rending your garments. HaKorea alaviv alimo ve'al Rabo shelimdo Torah, and your rabbi who taught you Torah, not just any rabbi, but one that you learned Torah from, you tear Kriya for, and you can never fix it. Ve'al Nasi, and on the Nasi, we talked about him, right? He was like the leader of the Jewish people. We'll see soon. They're going to say he was like the king, basically. Ve'al Av Beit Din, the person in charge of the courts. Ve'al Shmuot, right? He was a big important person. It wasn't just in charge of one court, but he was right? It was like the person under the Nasi. Val shmuot haraot, if you hear bad news, we'll see what that is exactly, or not exactly, but somewhat. Val birkat Hashem, if you see someone who curses in the name of God, or disgraces God's name. Val sefer Torah shenisraf, if a Torah was burned. Val arei Yehuda val mikdash val Yerushalayim, if you see the cities of Judea or the Mikdash, or right, the temple, or Yerushalayim in its destruction. Meaning, right, if it's not rebuilt. So by the way, people who go to the Temple Mount generally tear Kriya, okay? Because it's basically, right, if you go to Jerusalem now, it's certainly not a destroyed city. So you don't need to tear Kriya. But if you go, or the Judean cities, but if you go to where the temple was and there's no longer a temple there, so then you would. And this is going to add a whole new section that we're going to discuss later on the daf, which is what we call Tosefet Kriya. Adding on. If you tear for the Mikdash, right, you can tear for the Mikdash and add on about Yerushalayim. Okay, so then you can add on to your tear that was already there, you can add on more. So we'll get to that later and we'll talk about it more. Aviv v'imo v'rabo shelimdo Torah minaran. So that's the end of the Braita. Now we want to go back to each section of the Braita and understand the source for it, which is very typical that a Braita doesn't really tell us what the sources are. Comes the Gemara and they want to know, where does this come from? Dichtiv ve'elisha ro'eh v'hu mitzaek avi avi rechav Yisrael u'parashav. We already quoted this. When Eliyahu goes up to the heavens, right, he kind of disappears, almost. Okay, and we'll talk about it soon. The Gemara is going to say, but I understand he didn't die, right? This is why Eliyahu appears in all these stories, because you never really see him die. He just kind of goes up in a chariot. So Elisha sees and he screams, Avi, Avi, Rechav Yisrael u'parashav. He says a very strange line, even though it's a very famous line. We've all heard, possibly you've heard it this many times. My father, the chariot of Israel and its henchmen. So what does Rechav Yisrael u'parashav have anything to do with this? And why Avi, Avi, my father? So, and then what happens after in the same verse is it says, V'lo ra'au od, and he never saw him anymore after that. V'yichazek b'begadav, he holds on to his clothes. V'yikaem l'shnayim ka'im, and he tears them into two parts. Okay, he basically tears them in two. We already used this before, and we said, how do you know the tear has to be at the neck and not somewhere in the middle of the garment? Because if you tear it in the middle of the garment, it won't be in two, right? We said, why did it have to say he tore it into two? It would have been obvious, just say he tore it, and it would be in two. So it must teach us that halacha. So now we're going to learn some other things from this. Avi, Avi, Zavivimo. That's a reference to father and mother. Why does it say Avi twice? My father, my father. Oh, because it's a reference to father and mother, the father and mother you need to tear. Okay. Rechav Yisrael u'parashav, ze rabo shelimdo Torah. So Rechav Yisrael u'parashav, right? The chariot of Israel and its horsemen. Ze rabo shelimdo Torah. This is your rabbi who taught you Torah. How do you get from there? Chariots, horsemen, to someone who taught you Torah? So Gemara asked that question, my mashma, how did you get from that to that, right? That's not exactly the same thing. Kidim Targum Rav Yosef, as Rav Yosef did the Targum, the translation on that pasuk. His words were Rebbe, right? It's translated Avi, Avi, my father is my rabbi, my rabbi. Ditav lahon Yisrael bitzlote meritichinu parashim. His tefillot are better for the Jews than the chariots and the horsemen. Again, what's the connection, right? Basically, it's saying, Eliyahu, you were greater and your prayers were able. What do horsemen and chariots do? They get you from place to place. And I think what they're saying is, right, there's the physical getting from place to place, and there's the spiritual getting from place to place. And your prayers were much stronger and got people to move people to other places more so than the chariots and the horsemen move people to places. That's how I understand it. Okay, so that showed us the first two categories, Aviv Imo, Rabo Shalimdo Torah, right? The rabbi who taught him and his father and mother, you tear kriya, but it didn't teach anything about how you know you can't fix it. So v'lo mitachim minal, and you have to remember this word mitachim, and we're going to call it achoto, and any kind of form of this word is going to be, again, to stitch it up properly, professionally. So how do you know that you can't do that? Dichtiv v'yichazek b'bagadav v'yikraim l'shnayim kraim. When it says he tore it into two, Mimash Mishanemar v'yikraim is the exact same thing we said last time, because it says I tore it, what, eni yodesh l'shnayim? Do I not know that's going to be in two? From here you learn they have to stay in two forever. You can never properly fix it. Now, it's a bit of a problem because we know there's a rule. Once you learn one thing from a drasha, you can't, from a way something is worded, you can't learn two things. So some people actually have a different version here. And it's not from the word shnayim, because shnayim, we already learned what I said before about splitting it, cutting it at the neck, tearing it at the neck. But some people have the version that it says, Vayikraim l'shnayim kra'im. Right? It could have just said he tore it in two. Why does it say in two tears? So the word that is extra that we're referring to here is the tears, and how the tears have to stay forever. So that's a better explanation. So Elam Elamed, right? So from here we learn they have to stay forever like that. Amarle Rish Lakish to Rabbi Yochanan. Why are we learning it from a story like this? Eliyahu Chayu. Eliyahu never died. He's still alive. That's why he appears in all these stories. It's the famous Eliyahu was in the shuk and Eliyahu was here and he's still alive. He never really died. So Amarle, Kevan Dichtiv Lo Ra'ahu Od, right? And then they're saying, why are you learning laws of Kriya when somebody dies from someone who never really died? So they say, because it says in the verse there, V'lo Ra'ahu Od, and he never saw him anymore, Ligabe Didei Kimei Dame. For Elisha, it was as if Eliyahu died, okay? Because he wasn't really there anymore. We're now going to learn the next three. We learned already the first two, which is really three people, father, mother, and rabbi, from one verse. Now we're going to learn the next three categories, Nasi, Av, Beit Din, and Shmuot Ra'ot, bad bearings, from the same verse as well. Not the same verses before, but all these three from one verse. Dichtiv. Okay, there was a battle in Sefer Shmuel, and Shaul dies, Yonatan dies, and many of the people die. So the reaction of David was, V'yachazek David b'bgadav v'yikraim. He holds onto his garment and tears it. From here we saw before that you have to tear a tefach. We'll see today this machloket about this, because it says, right, when you grab something, what do you grab it with? Your fist, and your fist is a tefach, right? That's a hand's breadth. Hand's breadth. So it says he grabbed onto his clothes and tore them. V'gam kol ha'anashim asher ito. Not just David, everybody was with him. Vayispedu vayivku vayatzimu ad ha'erev. So they gave eulogies, they cried, they fasted till the evening. Al Shaul, now here goes, on Shaul, al Yonatan beno, Yonatan his son, Val Am Hashem va'al Beit Yisrael ki naflu b'charev, and for the whole nation or all the people that died by the sword. So Shaul ze nasi. Shaul is like the nasi, king, right? What's the closest we have to king in our time? Again, not our time, but in their time, the nasi, I guess you could say in our time as well, maybe the president is the closest thing. In those days also, the Nasi always came from Beit David, from the Davidic dynasty, right? We don't have that rule anymore in Israel, but it came from the Davidic dynasty, so it was definitely king-like, even though here we're mourning Shaul, who wasn't from Yehuda, but we're not going to get into that right now. Yonatan Za'av Beit Din, he was like the next in command, so he was considered like the Av Beit Din. Obviously, there was no Av Beit Din in those days, or they didn't have the same structure that they had in the time of the Gemara that they're discussing. Al Am Hashem v'al Beit Yisrael elu shmot ha'ra'ot. This is the bad bearings that a lot of the Jewish people died. Amar le Rav Bar Shva le Rav Kahana. So Rav Bar Shva is a good question. He says maybe Ema adav kulu. Maybe they all mourned and tore their garments because of what? Because all three things happened. The Nasi, the Av Beit Din, and the people died. Maybe only when you have all three together do you need to do it. So Amarle, no, al hifsika inyan. Notice it says in the pasuk al Shaul on account of Shaul al Yonatan beno ve'al Am Hashem. But if we just said al Shaul and Yonatan and the people, then you could say that. But because it separates them with the word al, which means on account of or on behalf of, so it means that each one was considered separate. Another question before we get on to the next topic. We're now going to see a situation. If you really tear for bad bearings, we're going to see a story. Okay, before we start, I'm going to give you a little history. There was a guy named Shabor Malka. He was a king. Some people even say it was like a paro. It was a name of kings, the Persian kings. He was a Persian king, which maybe, spanned a few generations, or maybe it was one particular Persian king. Particularly this one had a good relationship with Shmuel, and he appears in a number of places. So he basically has this nice relationship with Shmuel, although we're going to hear a strange story about him in context of it. So ha'amrulei Shmuel, they told Shmuel one day, Katal Shabor Malka Tracer Alpha Yudai Bebizigat Kesari. He killed 12,000 Jews in the city of Mizigat Kesari. In the Steinsaltz, the Koran, they say that it seems to be a place in Greece, possibly. Vilo Kara, and Shmuel heard this news, and he didn't tear. Why not? So they say, Lo amre ele berov tzibor ukemaseh shaya. It has to be the majority of the community, like the Maseh Shaya in the time of Shaul, where most of the people weren't killed, but most of the people were involved in the battle. They were there. It's not the same as something that happens far away, and it doesn't affect most of the Jewish people. Yes, this was a tragedy. It was 12,000 people died, but it wasn't the majority of the people, and it wasn't similar to the story of Shaul and Yonatan, and therefore he didn't. So now the Gemara asks, wait a minute, Shabor Malka, we always know good things about him. Umi katal Shabor Malka Yehudai, did he kill Jews? Shabor Malka l'Shmuel. He says to Shmuel in a different situation, I should get rewarded because I've never killed Jews in my life. So what do they say? Hatan, fascinating answer. These Jews brought it upon themselves. Okay, sometimes Gentiles kill Jews and they're deserving of it. And that means that it's not one of these things that we would put on our list of, something that happened. Or even when Shabor Malka says, I've never killed a Jew, what he means to say is, I've never killed a Jew for no reason. Okay, but I had a reason in this case. And even it seems Shmuel thought it was a justified reason. So let's see what it was. Amar Rabbi Ami, lekal yetere de mizigat kesari pakashura de ludkia. From the sound of the meitarim, the strings of the musical instruments of the people in Bizigat Kesari, the walls of Ludkia were broken down. What does this mean? What it means is the people were rebelling. It's not clear whether the Jews were doing it or other people were rebelling against Shabur Malka. And the Jews in Bizigat Kesari were singing and dancing. They were so excited, and they basically praised those. They were excited about the fact that people were rebelling, and it made so much noise that it basically broke the walls in Ludkia, which was a different place, and that showed that they were basically what we call Moed b'malchut. They were going against the king, so of course they were deserving of death, right? They basically were rebelling against him. They were joining this rebellion, so because of that, they were deserving of death, and then that's why he still says, I never really killed Jews, because he killed them, but that's because it was their fault. Okay, going back to our Braita. Al Birkat Hashem Minala. So Birkat Hashem is somebody curses God. How do we know if you hear someone cursing God in God's name that you have to tear kriya and not fix it? Dichtiv vayavo Yakim ben Chilkiyahu asher al habayit v'shavna sefer v'yoach ben Asaf hamaskil el Chizkiyahu kru'ei begadim. Okay, this is a verse in Sefer Melachim. When Sancherib, the king of the Assyrian king, goes up to fight against the Jewish people, so he has this guy, Rav Shakeh, who's standing on the wall, and he starts saying these terrible things about God, like, where is your God? And who is he that he's going to do anything? And blah, blah, blah. And he basically curses God. So it says that Yakim ben Chilkiah, who was in charge of the house, and Shevna Sefer, and all these people, they came to Chizkiah with their clothes torn. So they must have torn their clothes when they heard Rav Shakeh. Tanu Rabbanat. Now we get into, right, whenever a kid curses and then the brother or sister goes to the mom and says, or the dad and says, hey, so-and-so said, he said this, right? And you're not supposed to really repeat the curse word, but you want to explain what happened, so you repeat the curse word. So here's a whole discussion about the Braita says here, if you hear the person curse, let's say Rav Shakeh cursed, I heard him, or my neighbor told me that I was there and I heard Rav Shakeh say blah, 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 blah. Right now, if he repeats it to me, because I'm hearing someone cursing in the name of God, even though that person's just telling me the story, I still have to tear kriya. But what happens when the Eidim come and they retell what happened? So they had seen it already and they had torn kriya then. Do they have to tear kriya again when they say it? So they say, they already tore before and therefore they don't need to. So now they say, what's the difference if they already heard it? They're hearing it again when they retell the story. It's like happening all over again. So, lo sal kadatach, no, we don't really think that. Why? Dichtiv, it says, Chizkiyahu wasn't there, but when he heard and someone told him, vayikat begadav. Now, what happens? Only he tears his clothes, not the person who told him the story. Now, you could just say that the Tanakh isn't interested in telling you about, right? They're only interested in focusing on Chizkiyahu, but they assume here, Hamelech kara v'hem lo kavu. Notice he tore, not the people who came to tell him the story, and therefore it must be the Eidim themselves, when they retell it, don't have to tear, but those who hear from them do need to. So that showed us we have to tear kriya. If you hear someone curse in the name of God. But what about not fixing it? Because it says kriya here, and it said kriya before, and we said the kriya there, right? And it can't be fixed. So the same thing with the kriya here. Sefer Torah shenisraf minalan, a Sefer Torah that burns. Where do we get this from? Dichtiv. But again, we're going to see all these stories that happened in the time of the kings. Vayhi kikro Yehudi shalosh telatot va'arba'a. Okay, there was a guy standing up reading from, we'll see exactly what he was reading. He read 3 or 4 psukim. And then what happened? It's not vayikra'eha. It should say yikra'eha. B'ta'al hasofer v'hashlech ha'la'esh asher ala'ach. Yehoiakim was the king. He was one of the later kings before the destruction of the temple. He heard what this sofer was reading, or the reader was reading, and he basically tears the Sefer Torah with a razor, the sofer's razor, the scribe's razor, and he throws it into the fire. Okay, and then the psukim say, I'll just read you a little bit more. Sorry, I'm finding it. Ad tom kol ha-megillah la'esh asher ala'ach, until he basically destroys the entire parchment. The whole thing gets burnt up. So here you have a Sefer Torah that's burned. Yehoiakim burns it. So now the question is, what exactly happened in this story? Let's explain. My shalosh latov ve'arba'a. What are the 3 or 4 psukim that he read that after which he decided to burn the Torah? Amrulei lihoyakim katav Yirmiyahu Sefer Kinot. This is before the destruction, but apparently Yirmiyahu already wrote part of Sefer Eicha. Okay, Sefer Eicha has 5 chapters. The assumption is he wrote chapters 1, 2, and 4. I'm sorry, 1, 2, and 4. 3 and 5 are a little bit of a different type, so the assumption is they were written later. Anyway, he wrote these 3 prakim. Amar lahu. So it was told to Yoakim that Yirmiyahu wrote this whole book talking about the tragedy of what's going to befall the Jewish people. So Yoakim was the king, doesn't really like this, right? He says, Maktiv, what does it say in this book? Echa yashva badad, right? The city's going to sit alone. Amar lahu, ana malka. His reaction, I'm the king. This ain't happening, right? What do I care? Amar lo, bachotiv kebalayla. The people will be crying at night. This is, by the way, the first 5 psukim. It's aleph bet, right? The order of the beginning of each verse. Aleph echa, bet bacho. Ana malka, he says, that doesn't bother me. I'm the king. This doesn't affect me. Galta Yehuda me'oni. The people of Judea will leave, impoverished. Ana malka, I'm the king. This doesn't affect me. Darkei Tzion avelut. The paths of Zion are full of mourners. Ana malka. And he basically says, I'm above all this. This Churban is not going to affect me. When he gets to the 5th pasuk, after 3 or 4, Hayut tzareha lerosh, those who basically are going to oppress us are going to become the leaders. And then basically saying, you're going to be ousted. That already got to him. Amar lehu says, Man amara, who said this? And then they read from the continuation there, Ki Hashem hoga al rov psha'eh, right? That's the end of that verse, because God is the one who said this is going to happen for all the sins of the Jewish people. Miyad kadal kol askarot sheba u'schafam be'esh. He immediately cuts out all the references to God and throws it into the fire. V'hainu dichtiv, and then it says, now how do we get to tearing kriya here? V'lo pachadu v'lo karu et bigdehem. Nobody was scared and nobody tore their garments. What do you learn from here? Just like we learn from other places where it says they didn't mourn and they should have, right? They should have mourned. They should have torn their clothes. So they should have torn their garments, and therefore we learn you're supposed to tear your garments when you see the Torah, and it was just the people were in such a bad state that they weren't even affected by this. Why didn't you say it was bad tidings? This is a good example. It wasn't because they burnt the Torah. It was because of all the bad news that they heard in the Megillah. There were no bad tidings. Nothing had happened yet. It was just describing what was going to happen. You can't say that's bad news. So Amar Rabbi Chelbo, Amar Rav Huna, Haroeh Sefer Torah shenikan. Now we're bringing a similar thing, which is if you see a torn Sefer Torah, chayav likloah shtei kriyot. You have to tear 2. Why? Echad al hagvil ve'echad al hachtav. One because of the parchment itself, which has sanctity to it, and one because of the words. Okay, there's 2 parts to it. We learned this already in Megillah, if you remember. So therefore, we didn't learn about kriya, but we learned about the different, right? That both of them have sanctity to them. Shenemal, how do we know this? Because in this section, it says, after he burned the Megillah and the words. So you see there's the Megillah, which is the parchment, and the words themselves. Rabbi Abba v'Rav Huna bar Chia havu yatve. Now, there's a little bit of a problem with the nusach here. They were sitting, period. Kam, instead of kameh de Rabbi Abba, they couldn't have, the 2 of them couldn't be sitting in front of one of the 2. So it doesn't make sense. So they changed the nusach to Kam Rabbi Abba. Rabbi Abba gets up. They were sitting learning. Rabbi Abba gets up. By lipnuya, he has to go to the bathroom. So shakle letot fateh, takes off his tefillin. Achte abesadya, he puts them down on a bench. Ate batni na'amita, by lemivle, an ostrich comes over and wants to eat his tefillin. When he gets back right, he sees this happening. He saves it from happening, but he says, Hashi chayvin lishtei kriyot, I have to tear 2 kriyas. Amar le minalacha. So the guy sitting with him, Rav Huna, says to him, what are you talking about? This exact thing happened to me. I guess there were ostriches around that were eating tefillin. Says this exact thing happened to me. I went to Rav Matna to ask what to do. He didn't know what to tell me. So I went to Rav Yehuda, asked him what to do. They only said it when it was bizroa. They did it intentionally, or we'll have to see exactly how to translate bizroa. Bizroa usually means with your arm. And like the case that happened, meaning it's only like when Yehoiakim did it on purpose. This was an ostrich came over. This wasn't someone came physically saying, I want to destroy your tefillin. No, it was like just a kind of fluke thing that happened. So some people say that the issue here is that he didn't do it for the purposes of Chilul Hashem, right? Yehoiakim did it to disgrace the name of God. This was an ostrich, just came over and ate it. That's not the same thing. But Rashi, the printed Rashi here, says something very interesting. It says something else, which is she'ein yachol lahatzilo. It couldn't have been saved. Okay, whereas the ostrich, he was able to save it. So that maybe there's a difference between, right, Yehoiakim, there was no chance to save it at all. So maybe that's the difference. I don't know where he gets that from, because it's certainly not the simple reading of what Bizroa is. But anyway, it would maybe, I guess Bizroa is the koch that you can't, it was with force that you couldn't actually stop it. Okay, Arei Yehuda Minalan. Continuing on, how do we know about Arei Yehuda, the city of Judea? You see it destroyed, you have to tear kriya. Dichtiv vayavo anashim mishchem u'mishilo u'mishomron 80 ish megulachei zakan u'koei begadim u'mitkodedim u'mincha u'levona biyadam lavi beit Hashem. Okay, these people come, this is in Sefer Yirmiyahu, these people come to the temple after the destruction. They don't realize it's destroyed. So first they pass through the Judean cities that are destroyed because there was the whole exile. And they get to the temple with their livona, their frankincense, they're all ready to offer things, and they realize the temple is destroyed. Now, notice how they're described. They come with torn clothing. Why were their clothes torn? Now, one explanation could be it's just saying they've been walking for a long time and their clothes wore out, but they assume they must have gone through the Judean cities, seen them destroyed, and therefore tore their clothes. Amar Rabbi Chelbo, Amar Ula Bira'a, Amar Rabbi Elazar. Now, instead of, in the rest of the section, instead of finding proofs, how do we know if you see Yerushalayim or the Mikdash? I think once you see the Judean cities destroyed, it's obvious that you have to see, that you have to tear kriya when you see these other things destroyed. So therefore, instead of bringing proofs, what they do is they bring something that you're supposed to say each time you go to one of these places. There's a certain statement you're supposed to make, and then you tear kriya. So this is what you should say. If you see Arei Yehuda when they're destroyed, you say, Arei Kodshecha Yumidbar, your holy cities are now a desert. V'korea, and then you tear. Yerushalayim b'chorbanah, if you see Jerusalem, Omer Tzion Midbar Hayata v'Yerushalayim Shmama, right? Zion has become a desert and Yerushalayim desolate. V'korea, and then you tear. Beit HaMikdash b'chorbanah, Omer Beit Kodshenu v'Tifartenu, this was our sanctified holy place and beautiful place. Asher Hilelucha Avotenu. Hayalas Chayfat Esh, right? The place where our fathers praised you is now just a site of a burning. V'chomach madenu hayala chorban, all of our beautiful things, our special items are now destroyed. Korea al mikdash umosif al Yerushalayim. Now we're going to talk about this tearing for the mikdash, and you can be mosif on Yerushalayim. Uriminu, this contradicts another source. Echad hashomea ve'echad haro'eh, one who sees or one who hears. Kevan shigia litzofim, Korea, when he gets to Tzofim, right, the high spot by Har Tzofim, he tears. Korea al mikdash b'fnei atzmo v'al Yerushalayim b'fnei atzma. This says you do a separate kriya for each of them. So that seems to contradict what we said. So they say lo kasha ha depaga b'mikdash b'reisha, ha depaga b'Yerushalayim b'reisha. Okay, if you get to the temple first and then you see the churvot, right? Then, 1 second, I have to get straight which one is which, because I want to make sure I didn't make a mistake on this before. Right. If you basically didn't see the city of Jerusalem destroyed in just the Mikdash, then you can tear on the Mikdash and then you can add. But if you first saw the Jerusalem and then you get to the temple, you can't add to that tear. Basically, the temple is so important that you have to tear for the Mikdash first. Okay, on a separate tearing. What does it mean? You get there and you didn't see the destruction. So if you could be in a closed caravan and you just didn't look out the window, you were sleeping on the ride and you missed it. It could be that you just didn't see it. Or maybe there's a way to get in without seeing the city. I don't know. Tanu Rabbanan. Okay, we're done now. That ends our section of this Breita that we started our daf with, and then we went into each one in depth. Now we're going to other Breitot today. It's mostly going to be quoting Breitot. All of these tears, any tear in general, not the ones we just saw, but generally in tears, you can stitch them up, base them. You can fold them over and kind of fix it up, gather it together, make like a ladder, these wide stitches, but not really good fine stitches, right? One right next to the other that you barely see it. Amar of Chisda, he wants to explain for the people of his generation, doesn't really help us. B'ichoy Alexandri. The Alexandrian ichoy is what we're talking about, the way they did it. Tanu Rabbanan, another Breita. Korea mitoch hashlav, mitoch hamalal, mitoch haleket, mitoch hasulamot lo yatsa. If you had a tear and then you fixed it up in this not such a great manner. And then you tear it again for the next kriya that you need. That doesn't count because it was never really fixed properly. You have to actually tear something that was in good shape. Mitocha ichoy, but if you would stitch something up properly, then yatsa, then you could. Amrav Chisda ubi ichoy Alexandria. Again, he explains it's what we mean. Ichoy, we mean the specific Alexandrian stitch. Tanu Rabbanan, another braita. Chashay lo afcho lamata ul'achoto. You can't fix your tear when it's up on top. But let's say you flip your cloak. Okay, you're wearing a cloak. Basically, they would open something at the top and then they'd have an opening at the bottom. Let's say you took the opening at the bottom and you stitched it together to make it more like a neck and you widen the one at the top. And then you fixed up your tear because your tear was no longer up at the top here. It's all the way at the bottom. Maybe that's okay. So according to the Tanakama, it's okay. Rabbi Shimon, this is right in a case where you can't do the achoto, to fix it properly. You can actually do it if you flip your garment. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, Osir lachoto. He says, no, you can't do this. You can't flip it and fix it. Ukishem shahamocher asur. Now, this is fascinating. We would have thought in the cases where you can't fix it, it's because you saw some terrible thing and you want to always remember that. So you can't ever fix it. And it's more a responsibility of the person, right? We have all sorts of things that we can or can't do. And some of them refer to a person and some of them refer to an object. This you would think, yes, it has to do with the object, but it more has to do with the person and their relationship with the object. But comes a fascinating halacha in this braita. Just like the mocher, asur lachoto, if it's mine and I want to sell it, so I can't fix it up because it's mine and I tore kriya on it, let's say for my parents. If I sell it to someone, this is on the cloak, on the beged. I can never fix it. No one else can ever fix it. It's a tear that has to remain forever. So it's not so much on the person, according to this, it's on the garment. So therefore, if I sell you a ripped garment, first of all, the whole concept of me selling you something torn is very interesting in and of itself, right? It shows a society where recycling was just a natural part of society, and people would use ripped clothing because there was, right, the shefa, the abundance that we live in our world, right, did not exist then. So it makes sense in that context. So he says, you have to tell the buyer, and the buyer has to know they're buying something that not only is torn, but they can never fix it up. Tanu Rabbanan. Now we're going to quote a braita that talks about how much you need to tear. Tchilat kriyat tefach. You start with a tefach. We saw that the other day. V'tosefet shalosh etzbot. If you want to add to it, you have to add 3 fingers, okay? A tefach is 4 fingers, because if I make a fist, right, it's 4 fingers wide. So only 3 fingers is the tosefet. If I, let's say, was mourning someone and I tore, and then another mourner came to me, right? Someone else died. I can basically add to that same tear. We're going to see later on how much can I add to what point of the cloak. But anyway, we'll start with this. So you have to add 3 more etzbaot, okay? The width of 3 etzbaot. We've seen this before. The 3 by 3 fingers is the smallest type of garment possible. So therefore, that was in Dine Tum'ah, laws of purity and impurity. If you remember that, the poor people use even a 3 by 3 etzbaot. So that's the minimum size. So here you see that that's also the minimum size for a tear. Again, for the tosefet, not for the tear itself. That's divrei Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Rabbi Yehuda thinks, no, tchilat kriyat shalosh etzbaot. Even starting your tear can be 3 etzbaot. V'tosefet kolshu, and when you add, any little amount is enough. Amar Ula, halakha Rabbi Meir b'kriyat, halakha Rabbi Yehuda b'tosefet. Ula says, we hold like Rabbi Meir by kriyat, has to be a whole tefach, but when it comes to the tosefet, you can do the smaller amount, just a little bit. Tanya Namihachi, Abraita to support this, Rabbi Yossi, Omer tchilat kriyat tefach v'tosefet kolshu. There you have Rabbi Yossi, takes a combination of both of them. Tanu Rabbanan, another braita. Amru lo meit aviv v'kara, meit beno v'hosif. If your father dies, you tear your tefach, right? And then, or whatever amount you tear, then your son dies and you add a little more. So tachton mitache, you can fix up the extra part, elione no mitache, but you can't the top part. This makes sense with everything we learned. For a parent, you can't fix it up. What if meit bino v'kara, and then meit aviv v'hosif, and for the father, he just added, el yom mitache, you can fix the top part, but tachtone no mache, you have to leave that tear where you ripped for the father still unfixed. Meit aviv, meit imo, meit achiv, meit achoto. What if they all die or you hear about their death all at the same time? Okay, this right nowadays, this would be a tragic car accident or terrorist incident where a lot of people in one family were wiped out. Korea kera echad kulam. You only tear kriya once. Rabbi Yehuda be'betera omer al kulan kera echad. Alaviv alimo kera echad. Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera says you can't mix your parents with other ones. Even if you hear all at the same time, you have to tear two separate ones. He thinks that you can't even add to a tear for your parents. You tore for your parents, you can't add onto it for anyone else, like we saw before, that you could. He says you can't. My time, Amar of Nachman bar Yitzchak. What's the reason? Nachman bar Yitzchak says, Lefisha einam b'tosefet. Because, right, out of respect for your parents, you just can't do that. Amar Shmuel, halacha ke Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera. Shmuel says, we hold like Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera that you don't do this. Umi Amar Shmuel hachi, wait a minute. Shmuel, he's the one who's always lenient, remember? So why would he be stringent here and say you have to tear a separate tear for your parents? Remember, we're always lenient. So what is the answer? Avelut lechud, kriya lechud. Avelut and kriya are two different things. Okay? There's laws of avelut. We're always going to be lenient. Laws of tearing your garment, yes, it's connected to mourning, but it's separate. That he's willing to be stringent about. How far down can you keep adding and adding and adding and adding? So Tanakama says ad tiburo, until the navel. Yeshomrim ad libo. Some people say until the heart. Once you get to the heart, what do you have to do? So we'll see right now. In a minute, we're going to have a proof, or at least somewhat of a proof from the Torah for libo. Right? It's right. It's not from the Torah. It's from Yoel, Sefer Yoel, from the Nevi'im. Tear your hearts and not your clothes. So here there's this connection that clothes and hearts go together. Higia tiburo, according to Tanakama, if you get up to your navel, or according to the other opinion, if you get up to your heart, marchik shalosh etzbaot v'korea. So now you have to move 3 etzbaot over, 3 fingers breadth, 3 fingers width to the side, and then tear in the other part. Okay. What if you end up, right, you tore to your heart or to your navel all through the whole front of the garment? So, right, it's hard to imagine this situation. We would just take a new cloak, right? But what they do is they say, right, again, they're reusing the same one. If it's all full and you have nowhere to tear kriya anymore, you turn it around and then you use the back side, you put the back side on the front. If the whole thing in the front and the back is all torn, you flip the garment and wear it the other way. Okay, so again, you can't tear from the bottom, but you can flip your cloak and now tear it from the top. Also from the sides, you can't tear. This is very interesting. Kohen Gadol is not allowed to tear their clothes, but here we hear that if he really wants to, he could do it from the bottom, because that's not the real way to tear. At least we give him some sort of tearing that he can do, but it's not in a noticeable way. It's at the bottom, and therefore it's fine. They had a debate. They both debated what the father of Shmuel and Levi said. One said, until now, we've been talking about adding to a tear. They're now saying that when we talk about adding to a tear, what we mean is not within the Shiva, okay? You tore in Shiva. After the Shiva is over, then you can tear more. That's one opinion. But Chanamar, Kol Shloshim Korea, Lachar Shloshim Mosif. The other opinion says, no, you have to wait till the end of the Shloshim to tear, to add to that tear. So if, let's say, someone were to die within your Shloshim, you wouldn't be able to add to the tear. You'd have to do a new one. If they died after the Shloshim passed, then you could take the same torn garment and just tear a little bit more. So now, Matkif la Rav Zera. Rav Zera comes and questions both sides and says, what's your logic? And I'm going to question you from that exact logic. He tries to think about what's unique about Shiva and after Shiva when it comes to tearing. So he says, because during Shiva, you can't baste it at all. You can't stitch it up in any way. So therefore, he says, and that's the reason why you have to wait till after Shiva to be mosif, to add. But so-and-so says, or somebody says, and we saw this already, a woman can do it immediately. So hachinami, you're going to say then, since a woman can do the shlila, she can baste it, even during the Shiva. So does that mean that she could add also during the Shiva? Because he's assuming those two are connected. So they say, no, that's just, it's not the letter of the law. The letter of the law is she really can't, but because it's not appropriate for her to walk around with torn garments, so we allow her to stitch it up a little. Okay, but that's a whole separate reason, not connected to the main halacha. So therefore, even a woman would have to wait after the 7 days to add to the tear. Manda amar kol shloshim korea amai. Diloni tan lachoto. What's unique about shloshim? You can't fix it up properly, right? You can't do the good stitches. Again, assuming this is for a relative, not for a parent. So if it has to do with the fact that you can't fix it permanently during the shloshim, and that's why. So does that mean a parent can never add to a tear because it can never be fixed? And even though we did see there was someone who said that, but they're assuming that's not the case. That's out of respect for your parents. It's not the letter of the law. The letter of the law is you can always fix it up. But out of respect, we don't allow you to do it. So that's an aside, doesn't affect this halacha of Tosefet. Tanu Rabbanan, another bright. Now we're going to get to all sorts of things about Kriya, about Avelut, other things in general. If you walk out, okay, you're about to go to the cemetery and you're supposed to tear Kriya there, but you already wear a torn garment and it makes it look like you already tore Kriya for this person, but you did it. You just took a torn garment because you didn't want to tear another garment. You're basically robbing the dead because you're not showing them proper respect, and you're robbing the people who are alive because you're tricking them into thinking that they're all going to think, oh, look, she tore a garment for the dead, and she really didn't. Okay, he, she, whoever it is. If you go and borrow a garment and say, listen, I'm going to visit my sick father, can I borrow your shirt? So he gets there and finds out his father's dead. You basically tear it and then you stitch it up, okay, properly, because it's not your garment. Even though it's for your parent, but it wasn't your garment to mess up like that. Now, obviously, it's worth a little less, even though you stitched it up very well. So you have to pay them the value that the loss. But if you borrowed the shirt and you didn't say, I'm going to visit my sick father, which means they didn't have any thought in thinking it was going to end up being torn, then you can't tear this at all because it's not fair. It's not yours. Okay, that's why some people will go to Harabayit and they'll wear someone else's clothes in order to avoid tearing Kriya. Tanu Rabbanan, cholesh shemet lo met. This is a very difficult, complicated halacha, and I'm sure there's people here who have had to deal with this. You have someone who's very sick, and someone died in their family. We're worried it might cause their death if they hear that someone close to them died. I know this is a very big debate in many families where they have someone elderly and they don't know whether they should tell them or not. It's a very big issue. Now, we don't want them to find out accidentally. So you make sure that no one tears Kriya in front of them, right? Or wears their torn garments. And the women who are the mekonenot, they would sing these lamentation songs. They quiet them when they're near that person so that they don't get wind of the fact that someone has died. These two halachot we saw already, that you tear for a young child, even though they don't understand from it, but it's for other people to see and realize, right, if they lost a parent. And you tear for a mother-in-law and father-in-law out of respect for your wife. The Amar of Papa. Tana ba'avel rabati, aval lo yaniach tinok b'toch cheko, mipnei shemivio lidei schok v'nimtzam et ganei labriot. This is a fascinating halacha. It's even quoted in the Shulchan Aruch. When you're sitting shiva, you shouldn't put a little kid on your lap and play around with them because people will say, oh, what's this person so happy about? Aren't they mourning? Very interesting halacha. I'm sure you've been to places where they do this, right? It's not necessarily the most kept halacha. Some people say it's not a problem if there's nobody there, right? When there aren't people visiting you that will say that kind of thing about you. Maybe nowadays you would just say nobody would say that about you. Anyway, it's interesting. Aim Mavlin, last part for today. Aim Mavlin amitot kufot. This was in the Mishnah. You don't do the Sudat Havra'ah, right? You do it specifically, right? This actually, there's a problem with the nusach. Should it be Aim Mavlin amitot kufot or Aim Mavlin ela amitot kufot? This also depends on how we read the Mishnah, whether it was Chol Moed or not, whether you eat on a bed that's normal, or you flip it over for the Sudat Havra'ah. So Tanu Rabbanan, haolech lebeit ha'avel, im haya libo gaspo yavruhu amitot kfuyot. If you come to a Beit Avel and they're eating the Sudat Havra'ah, you're a friend, and you're a friend who's a very close friend. That's what it means, ein libo gaspo, although there are different interpretations, but we'll go with that. Then you eat on the bed lower. You lower the bed. V'im lav yavruhu amitot kfuyot. If not, you're not a close friend, then they put the bed normal and everybody sits higher up. So why is that? Some people say there's different reasons given. Some people say if it's your good friend, you might, like the baby, you might engage in happy, pleasant conversation and lightheaded conversation, and we don't want that. So we make sure to remind you, you sit low down.
But if it's someone you're not comfortable with anyway, then that won't really happen. So funny story to end the daf, or kind of interesting. Rabbi Itrabe Milta, something happened to him, meaning someone died. Alagabe Abba Bar Marta, do Abba Bar Yumi. He goes by two names. He came. Rabbi Zakif, Rabbi put the table up high because he said, he's not my good friend. But Abba Bar Marta Kafe, he put it low. He said, I am his good friend. So Rava, I guess he was in a bit of a mood because he was a mourner. He says, Amal, Kama lepe data lahitz over Rabbanan. This guy really knows nothing. This Talmid Chacham really doesn't know very much, right? He has no clue where he stands in our friendship, right? Some people know this. Sometimes this happens, right? Somebody thinks they're your good friend, or you think they're your good friend. And it turns out they don't really think that way. Anyway, Rava says basically, again, there's a few different ways to understand the story, but according to one reading, he basically says he doesn't understand his place, that we don't really have such good friendship, and he really doesn't get it. With that interesting story, we will end today's daf. Have a great day, everybody.